Welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I teach communication here at Purdue Calumet. Today I'm joined by my guest, Meredith Nevers, who is a microbial ecologist. She works at the U.S. Geological Survey for the Great Lakes Science Center in Porter, Indiana. I didn't even know that was there, so maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that. She studies microbial ecology, which we will discuss a bit. She studies water quality and also the impact on ecosystems. I'm not going to read your long list of publications, but there's dozens of publications, many on the Great Lakes, which is of quite a bit of importance to us here in Northwest Indiana. So let me begin by asking you to explain what an ecologist is and maybe what the difference between an ecologist and a research ecologist is.
I would define ecologist as someone who's interested in the interactions of organisms, how organisms interact with one another in the patterns of feeding, in their habitat, any sort of interaction. I'm trained as an aquatic ecologist, so my interest has always been in primary production, phytoplankton, and nutrient loading, but I've also worked in microbiology, including bacterial communities. So in my position as a research ecologist, my job is to basically explain these interactions, looking at these organisms, how they're working together in the Great Lakes ecosystem.
So when you talk about the impact on ecosystems, you're talking about the impact of bacteria, plankton, other things that are naturally in the Great Lakes?
Yes, yes. I would say the microbial community in the Great Lakes is by far one of the least understood components of the Great Lakes ecosystems. And they obviously are forming a large part of the base of the food web. And so any changes to the microbial system or microbial community will have a cascading effect on organisms going up the food chain. And so ultimately they have a role on the fish communities that are in the lake.
So if there's less bacteria or there's less plankton, then there's less for somebody to eat going up the food chain.
Right, and if there's a shift from what we might call good microbes and good plankton to less nutritious, they don't make as good a food source, then it will impact what organisms will thrive in the Great Lakes.
So why would this vary? I mean, the Great Lakes have been here for hundreds of years. Why would, I mean, it seems like it's a relatively stable ecosystem. Why would what's in the water change?
Well, largely it's anthropogenic impacts, the impact of human settlement and human development, urban development on the nearshore ecosystem. And so what you'll see is in areas of perhaps less impact, less development, will have a different microbial community than what you would see, for example, in the Chicago nearshore. You would have
So where Chicago is and they're dumping a lot of wastewater and a lot of sewage, you're going to have a different set of microbes or everything that goes from there than on the Michigan side, where you might be south of Muskegon and there's not as many wastewater treatment plants or sewage plants?
Exactly. So, you know, in terms of Lake Michigan, typically the further north you go, the cleaner the water is, but typically that's associated with a healthier microbial community.
I guess I'm troubled here because I read the newspapers a lot and I read about the technology and the wonderful things that capitalist development has done for us. And one of those things is not to worry, we have the technology. When the water leaves our sewage treatment plant, it's just as good as the water that goes into Michigan. Are you suggesting that's not true?
The problem is not the treated wastewater, it's the untreated wastewater, which is permissible under most state standards during events of very high rain or when the sewage treatment plants are unable to keep up with capacity. You will see treatment plants will overflow their sewage, which basically means they have permits that say, we can't keep up, we're just going to let the sewage go through.
So it just gets dumped right into the lake?
Yes.
And how often does this happen?
It depends on the community. In Northwest Indiana, there are several cities that have combined sewer overflow permits. Hammond, Gary, Most, Chesterton, Michigan City.
So
Chicago,
what, we get
obviously.
1 inch of rain and that's going to be, I mean, can we expect at certain levels of rainfall or melting snow or something that this is happening?
Typically, yes. It would have to be fairly high threshold for most sewage treatment plants. Now, a lot of sewage treatment plants are being re-engineered to improve that. And IDEM works with these sewage treatment plants to increase their capacity, to encourage them, force them to increase their capacity. But it depends on the infrastructure. Some are much older and don't have the capability to keep up, and as human population grows and it gets harder and harder, getting funding for that kind of infrastructure upgrade is difficult.
Okay, you work for the federal government, so presumably the federal government knows that, has this information?
Yes.
Okay, I guess this isn't a question just for an ecologist, but
Right.
I mean, if we know for a fact that if it rains X number of inches, we're going to dump sewage into Lake Michigan.
Yes.
And dumping sewage into Lake Michigan is going to affect the microbes, and that's going to affect the quality of the water. And I've seen signs on Indiana beaches that you can't swim here.
Correct.
And your job is simply to report the facts, and it's somebody else's job to decide to let the facts filter out into the lake, so to speak.
Well, I'll say that the issue with combined sewer overflows is typically a state issue. Okay, so the work that I've been doing in near shore water quality and beach closures specifically has to do with predicting when it is going to be a problem, because you're right, there's certain situations and certain scenarios where you're going to have sewage in the water. How long that sewage is going to hang around on the shore, you can sometimes figure that out with hydrodynamic modeling. You can predict what the water quality will be, perhaps, after even if it's on the shore, how many days till it disappears.
How long it's going to go out to
Yeah.
Is disappears a good word? I mean, it's like I've got a bowl of water and, I spit up on this side. And
Right.
if it goes the other side, I could argue it disappeared, but the spit's still in the water. I mean, the sewage is still in the lake.
Right. It's combined. I would say this, that a lot of microbial organisms will die. They are, with sunlight or with exposure, they will be killed off. Some will get buried in the sediments, and so you have certain areas that have very high concentrations of bacteria in the sediments that gets
That means in the
resuspended.
sand and-
Exactly. But typically, the vast majority you'll see die off with any of the harmful pathogens.
That sewage too dies off, is what you're.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's because it's exposed to the sun.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So it's a natural breakdown, and it
within limits.
Right, right. And the problem is if you get a very large flush of sewage, it's not just the microbes, but it's anaerobic conditions. So there's no oxygen. So what it'll do.
Explain anaerobic for us.
Okay, anaerobic means there's no available oxygen. Nothing will be able to breathe in this material. And so if it washes up along the shoreline, what you'll get is anaerobic conditions, non-oxygen conditions that can basically kill off any organisms that are there. It'll kill off phytoplankton, zooplankton.
So if it goes up on the shore, it's going to kill the natural plant life and the
until
plankton.
It gets
Yes.
oxygenated again, yeah.
Okay. Has it ever happened that you create a dead zone? I mean, does it happen that it doesn't grow back?
Not so much in the Great Lakes. You're probably familiar with the dead zone of the Mississippi River, where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. There's a vast area that they just call the dead zone because there's so much anaerobic
as it's going into the Gulf.
as it's going into the Gulf. Yeah, so much sediment, which causes anaerobic conditions as well, that you get a massive dead zone. Nothing can live in it. We don't see that in the Great Lakes. There's enough movement, water movement, and it's not typically that loaded with sediment and material that would do that.
So it's the movement in the Great Lakes is a churning movement because the Mississippi is kind of cleansing itself, so to speak.
Right.
But do the Great Lakes do that? Is there a cleansing process with the lakes?
There is.
And how does that? I mean, I don't want to be overly technical for the people who are watching, but it just, I mean, I understand the waves come in, the waves go out, and things like that.
Right.
But what's the
So what we were referring to with the unoxygenated water, what you'll get is it starts to dissipate. The waves keep moving it around, the sediment moves around, any sewage moves around, and you will get a dilution effect. You know, there's a massive amount of water in any of these Great Lakes, so it'll get diluted to the amount that it just dissolves and is taken back into the system.
Okay, again, my bowl example.
Mm-hmm.
I put something in, it gets diluted. I put more in, it gets diluted. It would seem at a certain point, the dilution, it may dilute, but it's no
Right.
longer 100% water, it's 95% or
Right.
94%. I mean, it seems like over time, particularly as more wastewater and more flooding happens, that the dilution doesn't go back to a natural state or even an
Right.
acceptable state, that the dilution keeps raising in its level of pollution, for the lack of a better word.
Right. Well, there's a few things to consider. One, the material coming in with sewage would be that would be concerned about would be the bacteria and viruses associated. Those are the ones that are going to make people sick. That's what you don't want to be in. That stuff mostly will die off. Okay, the bacteria will die off.
In the sun, and it'll just die. Okay.
Yep, and then basically anything else that's in it, any sediment, any sediments, the other big pollutant, but basically anything else, and even the broken down microbes or pathogens will be used as a nutrient source for other organisms. You know, it's the whole cycle has to do with breakdown and then, you know, consumption by other organisms.
I guess a certain amount of sewage is going to be a
It's
useful
a food source.
nutrient for somebody else
There's
within
tons
limits and reasons.
of nutrients in
Okay,
it.
I think we have to take a short break now. We'll be
Okay.
back in a few minutes, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what some of those other things might be that are in the water. So, this is Calumet Roundtable. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I teach communication here at Purdue. My guest today is Meredith Nevers, who is a research ecologist at the U.S. Geological Survey Great Lakes Center in Porter, Indiana. We were talking just before the break, Meredith, about wastewater and how there's a natural churning or movement in the lakes, and many of those just die off in the sun. Some don't and create problems, dead zones, I guess. If we move that a little bit away from the lake up to the rivers that come down, the rivers don't quite, at least as far as I know, don't have the same protection systems. Like sewage, you treat sewage, right? There's a certain waste that you try to treat. But when I think anyway about rivers and the farmland that's next to rivers and the herbicides or pesticides that are put on there, this all flushes into the river, and then the river takes it down to the lake. And how is that different than wastewater that's treated or usually treated?
Well, what you're referring to, we'd call runoff. Okay, so we deal with both agricultural runoff and urban runoff are both a problem. Agricultural areas have quite a bit of, as you said, pesticides, but farm fields are also fertilized, and so there's a lot more nutrients associated with agricultural runoff. And so anything that's on the land will eventually wash into the river in most of these areas, in many of these areas, I should say. And so that increase in nutrients will result again in change to the ecosystem. Typically, you'll see a bloom of algae initially, which can have effects on other organisms as well. Typically, algae blooms are sort of unpalatable algae, so they're not the best algae. And so that'll cause a shift in the ecosystem.
None of the animals in the lake will tend to eat the algae that grows on the nutrients from the runoff.
Quite often, yes, yes. What we've seen in the Great Lakes recently are harmful algal blooms and nuisance algal blooms. If you've ever been to the beaches in Northwest Indiana, sometimes you see this green algae washed up on shore in big masses.
Yes, yes.
It's Cladophora algae, which is a nuisance algae. It's
Nobody
considered.
eats this.
Nobody
it's
eats
not
it.
green from the sea.
It's not delicious.
Okay.
Organisms will often eat organisms that live on it, but nothing can eat it because it's a very harsh algae.
And this grows from the runoff, or that's the primary
largely
reason.
because there's increased nutrient loading and increased clarity in the water, basically. But that's become a real problem, particularly in urban areas where there's a lot of places for this algae to grow, because it grows attached to hard substrates.
And that's what grew in Toledo last year?
Toledo is a different one. It's called, yeah, I know. There's a bunch of different ones, but this was Microcystis Bloom. It's a blue-green algae, and was thought to be caused by nutrient runoff from farmlands.
Okay.
And basically too much nutrients resulted in this bloom that affected the drinking water in Toledo. And I believe it was 300,000 people were without drinking water for about a week because
They could just go to the store and buy bottled
that's
water.
what they had to do. That's what they had to do. There was no water from Lake Erie that was drinkable because of this this harmful algae that has a toxin in it that causes a neurological impairment, so you can't drink it.
So farmers use the herbicide or pesticide or some kind of nutrient to, if it's running off, does that mean that there's too much pesticide or herbicide or nutrients being put on the land
It's
in an attempt to
possible.
grow? So because
Yeah.
if it would seem like if you have the right amount, it's not going to wash away. It's going to go into what you're trying to harvest.
Right, and I don't know a lot about that, but yes, that the runoff is excess nutrients, excess pesticides and herbicides, and causes a suite of different problems.
When I step back from this, I think about urban areas that have wastewater, but there isn't enough foresight or attention to providing the proper infrastructure to have the proper treatment plants and preventing the runoff at bad times. I look at agriculture where farmers and agribusiness will use a lot of pesticides or herbicides to grow to maximize the sales. And again, this causes runoff. In both instances, it seems there isn't a recognition that there's a world outside your narrow city and your narrow pipeline or your ConAgra or your own business. And if I step back from that a little farther, I think about the world in which we live, because it seems that this also affects the Great Lakes. I've been reading the last couple of days about the drought in West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. They're trying to ration water because water evaporates.
Right.
And if there's a hole in the ozone, the water goes. So to what extent does that climate have an effect on the ecosystem of the Great Lakes?
Yeah, well, what you're, in the Great Lakes, the change in climate largely has been unpredictable, and so it's been more difficult to figure out what's going to happen as we continue to experience climate change. We've had a couple of very hard winters, which cause changes in the rate of sort of seasonality. We've also had some shorter winters, which have an impact on the rate of seasonality. And so
What do you mean by seasonality?
What I mean is
when things are supposed to grow?
Right. And so in the lakes, you expect, for example, a phytoplankton bloom, not a negative bloom, just a positive bloom in the spring, because all the ice melts off.
Right.
The lake, what it's called is the lake turns over. There's a vertical churning of the water, and there's nutrients available to phytoplankton, so you get a bloom. And certain organisms are depending on that bloom in the spring.
They show up to eat it.
And so if you offset that timing, the whole cycle gets thrown off.
If I show up in April and it's not there until May, I'm going to be hungry for a month.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So it's been a little unpredictable in terms of climate change. The prediction models for the Great Lakes region are showing that there's likely to be more rain with global climate change, and that would be more runoff,
Yes.
as you're talking about, and perhaps more sewage input. And so there's a potential for very negative impact in the Great Lakes, and I think that
Is there any potential for a positive impact? Not many people talk about climate change as the positive outcome, right? I mean,
yeah, true,
Okay.
true. And I think
I'm
it's,
sorry to
I think it's recently that we've sort of begun to put climate change into what we're researching. What is going to be the impact on what we're studying? A lot of work has been done in recent years with some federal funding called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And a focus of that recently has begun to be climate change. They want, the EPA directs these funds, and they want everybody to input what's climate change going to do to this project. And so any work or research you're doing, whether it's on a beach or with fish populations or fisheries abundance, what's going to be the impact of climate change. And so what we're seeing in our nearshore work is the potential for increased nutrient runoff. How are we going to, what can we do now to try and make the coast more resilient to that change?
Okay. It seems like the assumption there is that there's nothing you can do about climate change at all, or we're just going to have to accept this. We're adapting to it. I mean, the way you worded it is how you can make them more resilient to climate change, as opposed to what can we do to stop contributing to climate change.
Sure. Well, I guess I would put it in the terms that, you know, this is my piece of the puzzle.
Right.
You know, this is what I'm doing about it. I think that like I said, at the Great Lakes Science Center, we're obviously very concerned about the impact on the ecosystem. But what we're doing is looking at our area. What can we do, you know, to improve it? Or
So what could you do? I mean, if we say the seasonality is going to be unpredictable, or even if you were to be able to predict seasonality, let's say we could predict seasonality, that the phytoplankton are going to grow or appear a month later
Earlier.
than they used to. I mean, are you going to get people with nets and chase the fish away, or go get them and bring them? Your food's here, it's time to eat. I mean, what can you actually do about that? Because the change in plant life doesn't necessarily mean that the animal life is going to be able to adapt as quickly,
Right.
or vice versa, I
Right.
guess.
I would say what you could do is focus on the causative factors. Focus on the runoff. You know, try to improve best management practices in agricultural areas so you don't get that kind of runoff. There's a lot of emphasis now on green infrastructure. And so building, you know, rain gardens, or thinking about how you're going to decrease runoff in urban areas if you have an opportunity to restructure, you know, some system. Try and prevent those factors that we know are going to cause a problem, like nutrient runoff, as best we can now before the problem gets more severe.
Gets worse. Okay. As part of this climate change question, the other thing that I noted from reading about drought in the Southwest was there are several states that have requested, even on the federal level, access to Great Lakes water, because the Great Lakes belongs to everybody, and
Right.
we're part of everybody, so we should have our share of the Great Lakes water. I know you're an ecologist, but is there
Right.
anything that you could share with us about what the requests are, the potential claims to Great Lakes water might be, and what that would mean for the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the issue enough to speak on it. You know, I know that the Great Lakes have a massive amount of available fresh water, and so people will eye it. You know, it's a wonderful ecosystem we have right outside the door, you know, but it's a binational issue as well,
It is.
because, you know, Canada's on the other side of the lakes. So I don't know what.
Well, even from the point of view of an ecologist,
Yeah.
okay? You're studying this lake that's this deep, that's this wide.
Right.
That's its ecology. If you take 10% of the water, the ecology has changed. No?
Correct.
So when you say there's an abundance of water, there's only an abundance for this particular ecology.
Correct.
It's not an abundance like,
No.
go ahead, Arizona, take some, we'll still have
Right.
100,000 gallons left.
Right.
Yes.
You're going to, I mean, taking water out of the lake is going to impact the whole system. I mean, the coastline in particular, but the whole system ultimately.
Well, I'm impressed with what you know and your efforts and the efforts of other ecologists. I just wonder, you said it's not part of, well, it's not part of what you study, but on one level there's, it seems we've often been compartmentalized. I mean, I'm compartmentalized here at the university to talk
Right.
about communication and help some government agency improve their communication to make it more palatable, and you're here studying the ecology of Lake Michigan. But it often seems to me that there's a contradiction here, because private technology or private development, whether that's agriculture or wastewater or the technology that may save a particular treatment plant, is often at odds with public interest. And I just wondered if you have any requirement as an ecologist to speak to the public interest.
I think I have a requirement as a federal employee, certainly, to speak to the public interest. I would say that quite a bit of the emphasis in my work has been on collaborative work. So we've worked with universities and state agencies and NGOs, you know, working together to try and fix some of these problems, because I think you're absolutely right that there's everyone takes their little piece and works there, but more and more we're seeing interaction not only with all of these agencies, but also spreading beyond, you know, biology and environmental management, but looking at the social impact, you know, of what we're doing and how we can improve it, you know, so socially, economically, everything.
We're about to enter into what should be a second interview, so maybe we can have you back. Okay. That's all the time we have. I want to thank Meredith Nevers for joining me today on Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. Have a great day. See you next time. Thank you.